Vermont history. The Green Mountains' Forgotten Secrets. Vermont, a name that whispers through the mists of the Green Mountains, quiet, cold, and seemingly timeless. Nestled in the far northeastern corner of the United States, Vermont became the 14th state to join the Union on March 4, 1791. Yet long before this official date, this land was already brimming with enigmatic stories few today truly know. Bordered by Quebec to the north, New Hampshire to the east, Massachusetts to the south, and New York to the west, Vermont may seem isolated. Its capital, Montpelier, is one of the smallest in the nation, but beyond its sparse population and serene landscapes lies a history marked by conflict, disappearance, and survival. Whispers of the ancients. The first footprints upon this land belong to the Palear Indians, who ventured into what we now call northern New England around 9000 BCE. Just as the glaciers of the last ice age were retreating, they left behind more than traces. They left mysteries. Specialized slate tools, copper blades from the Great Lakes, and shells from the Gulf of Mexico found in Vermont suggest a vast, ancient network of trade and contact, civilizations connected in ways historians are only beginning to grasp. By 1050 CE, during the late woodland period, Vermont's fertile river valleys supported thriving settlements. But who were these people, and what became of them? Vanished tribes and silent conflicts. By 1600, the Algonquian-speaking Abenaki Confederacy dominated the region. Their territory stretched from Lake Champlain to the White Mountains, and from southern Quebec to the Massachusetts border. Among them, the Sakokee and Cowasuk lived along the Connecticut River. The Missisquoi made their home by the Great Lake. But the Abenaki weren't alone. The powerful Iroquois Confederacy lurked across Lake Champlain. The land was a frontier, an invisible line between rival peoples, cultures, and ambitions. Estimates suggest that over 10,000 Western Abenaki lived in the region before Europeans arrived. But in the shadows of progress came disease, war, and displacement. The colonial wars and the American Revolution swept through, scattering communities and erasing villages. Survivors either crossed into Canada or merged silently into the new Vermont population. Centuries later, their descendants would fight not with weapons, but with petitions for recognition. In 2006, the Vermont General Assembly finally acknowledged them, not with land, but with a name. The coming of strangers. In 1609, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain sailed into the lake that would forever bear his name. It was a place of dense forests, unbroken silence, and green peaks that seemed eternal. The French would be the first Europeans to settle here, founding their post on Isle La Motte in 1666. They called the region Vermont, Green Mountain, for the fir and pine that cloaked its slopes like a secret never meant to be revealed. But Vermont would not remain untouched. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw the land become a strategic route, a shadow corridor, for French and native raids into Massachusetts. Where peace failed, fortresses rose. The Dutch settled briefly in Pownal in 1724, but it was the English-speaking settlers who would claim Vermont with permanence. Fort Dummer, near what is now Brattleboro, marked the start of that expansion. With the British victory in the French and Indian War in 1763, Vermont's doors were thrown open to settlers. By the eve of the American Revolution, some 20,000 people called this place home. Even today, echoes of Connecticut and Massachusetts linger in Vermont's town names, a faint reminder of where those first settlers came from. But the soul of Vermont? That remains its own, wild, enigmatic, and evergreen. Revolution, rebellion, and statehood. Vermont's secret struggle for identity. Before it was a state, before it was even a recognized republic, Vermont was a battleground, not only of war, but of identity. Although European explorers ventured through this land long before the Pilgrims set foot in Massachusetts, Vermont's early development followed no royal script. It was not born of charter, nor crown. Instead, it emerged from shadowy land disputes and clandestine allegiances, claimed simultaneously by New Hampshire and New York, but truly loyal to neither. As settlers arrived in the decades leading up to the American Revolution, two rival powers issued competing land grants. New Hampshire made promises. New York enforced patents. And in the middle stood the settlers, caught in a rising storm. From 1770 to 1775, a ragtag but fierce group of settlers rallied under the banner of the Green Mountain Boys, led by the defiant Ethan Allen. These were no mere farmers, they were rebels, resisting the so-called Yorkers, who dared to control lands they never truly possessed. What began as a local land feud soon turned into armed resistance. Then came 1775. With war against Britain igniting across the colonies, the Green Mountain Boys struck first. In a bold pre-dawn raid, they captured Fort Ticonderoga, a British stronghold on the New York side of Lake Champlain. Many historians call this the first offensive act of the American Revolution. Yet even as they fought for independence from the British Crown, Vermonters were also fighting a second war, a quieter one, for independence from their fellow Americans. In 1777, in the midst of chaos, Vermont declared itself an independent republic and ratified its own constitution. It was a revolution within a revolution. The Continental Congress, already balancing fragile alliances, refused to recognize Vermont. To do so would insult New York, empower other separatist movements, and risk fracturing the fragile unity holding the colonies together. Yet Vermont's value couldn't be denied. In August 1777, its militia dealt a major blow to British forces at the Battle of Bennington, helping pave the way for the decisive American victory at Saratoga. Still, recognition never came. Refusing to wait for approval, Vermont's leaders pursued a bold and controversial diplomacy, annexing towns in New York and New Hampshire and even opening secret negotiations with the British in Canada, floating the idea of Vermont as a recognized neutral nation. What if Vermont had switched sides? What if America's 14th state had become its greatest affection? But in 1790, New York relinquished its claims. And in 1791, after 14 years of existing as an unrecognized republic, Vermont officially joined the Union, becoming the 14th star on the American flag, a state still in flux. The 19th century brought both booms and busts. Vermont briefly rose as a sheep and wool powerhouse, only to collapse under economic shifts. The anti-Masonic Party took control in the 1830s, a rare historical moment when fear of secret societies gripped the political landscape. By the 1840s, the Whigs held power, but barely. Then, in 1854, a coalition of anti-slavery and temperance advocates formed what would become one of America's most enduring political forces, the Republican Party. In Vermont, they were unstoppable. From the mid-1800s until 1958, no statewide office fell into opposition hands. It was a century-long political dominance unmatched in American history. Civil War shadows. During the American Civil War, more than 35,000 Vermonters went to war. Over 5,000 never returned. And in 1864, Vermont bore witness to the northernmost land action of the entire war, when Confederate raiders slipped down from Canada and attacked the town of St. Albans. A chilling reminder that even this quiet state was not beyond reach of fire. A rural identity preserved. After the war, Vermont transformed. Dairying overtook wool as the state's agricultural backbone. The Republican machine, with its careful balancing act between the east and west of the Green Mountains, maintained internal peace through informal power sharing. Meanwhile, a slow exodus of Vermonters to other parts of the country ensured that the state's population remained small, its rural essence preserved, its mountains stayed green, its history hidden, and its legacy still unfolding. Modern Vermont. Shadows of power, echoes of change. The quiet hills of Vermont have long concealed the pulse of American transformation. Even in the modern era, beneath the state's serene exterior, the forces of politics, identity, and power continued to shift, silently but irrevocably. In 1923, the stillness of a Vermont farmhouse was broken by history. Calvin Coolidge, then vice president, stood beneath the flickering light of a kerosene lamp in his family's home in Plymouth, Vermont. There, with his hand upon the family Bible, he was sworn in as President of the United States, following the sudden death of Warren G. Harding. It was an oath spoken not in marble halls, but in shadow and silence, a fitting beginning for a president from Vermont. But even as one of its own ascended to national power, Vermont was changing. Tourism and transformation. By the 1930s, a quiet revolution was underway, not of musket fire, but of mountains and snow. Vermont began to pivot its economy toward tourism, creating an identity as a refuge for those seeking escape. Ski resorts rose along the ancient slopes, turning Vermont into a year-round sanctuary for wanderers and winter dreamers. The hills that once guarded rebellious militias now welcomed visitors from across the nation. And with those visitors came change. Newcomers began to settle permanently, bringing with them new ideas, new politics, and a slow unraveling of the old order. The fall of a political dynasty. For over a century, Vermont had been a Republican stronghold, its loyalty unwavering since the Civil War. But the influx of outsiders began to erode that political foundation. In 1958, a Democrat was elected to Vermont's sole seat in the U.S. House, if only for a moment. Yet that moment cracked the dam. By 1962, Vermont elected its first Democratic governor since 1853. And in 1965, a court order forced the General Assembly to abandon its one-town, one-vote system, redistributing power from the quiet rural valleys to the growing urban centers. The old Vermont, rugged, isolated, unyielding, was slipping into memory. In 1985, a new milestone. Madeline Kunin became Vermont's first female governor, serving 3 terms and redefining leadership in a state long shaped by tradition. Voices from the fringe. By the 1990s, Vermont's congressional delegation painted a curious picture: a Democratic senator, a Republican senator, and an independent representative, a fiery figure known as Bernie Sanders. Labeling himself a Democratic Socialist, Sanders was the first independent in the U.S. House in 40 years. He would later win a seat in the U.S. Senate in 2006 and shake the foundations of American politics with presidential campaigns in 2016 and beyond. He wasn't alone. Howard Dean, another former Vermont governor, had run for president in 2004, showing that even this small state could cast long shadows on the national stage. The battle for equality. In 2000, Vermont once again stepped ahead of the nation, becoming the first state to recognize same-sex civil unions, not by court order, but by legislative will. That legacy continued in 2009, when the legislature overturned the governor's veto and legalized same-sex marriage. Vermont became the first state in U.S. history to do so through its lawmakers, not its judges. Quietly, with resolve, Vermont changed the course of civil rights in America. A state apart. Even now, Vermont remains both timeless and transformed. Its population has grown. Its economy has shifted. Yet the heart of Vermont beats with the same quiet independence it has held since the days of the Green Mountain Boys. The state has never needed a spotlight to shape history. It has done so from the shadows, softly, mysteriously, and with unshakable purpose. In Vermont, the past never fades. It lingers in the mist, in the mountains, and in the minds of those who remember. Subscribe to History Love for more immersive stories from America's most quietly powerful places. Because sometimes the smallest states hold the biggest secrets.